The Astute Steward, Part 3. Interestingly enough, this part of the teaching will only be on the first half of this verse. The next half of this verse we are going to attach to verses 9 to 13 and teach in that part of Luke chapter 16. We're calling this the Astute Steward. This in actuality is the fourth part, with the first part being an intro. And the Lord commended, notice I've got that highlighted, I've got that underlined. The reason is because we're going to focus on that specific word to begin with. And the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. That's the part of the verse we're going to deal with today. That being said, in every version you look at, when it gets to this verse, it says, the Lord commended, or it says that the Lord praised. I've got two examples of just such a case that you can see up there. You can look in yourself, whatever version you have. It will have one of those two. So my curiosity, is it commended? Is it praise? Well, stay tuned. Strong's, for the word commended, is G 1867. It says to applaud, to commend, to praise. Did that clear anything up? No. There's to, and this is it. It's right here. Look at this. To approve or to praise. In other words, you're not just commending somebody, you're in approval of what they're doing. And the reason I bring that up is because that adds a dimension of meaning to this. It actually clears it up. Let's move forward. Of greater significance is the eschatological usage of the Greek word in the New Testament itself. Prisker writes, and I can't read Greek, please forgive me, signifies the acceptance or approval. Now you see why we looked it up. Mr. Bailey, Kenneth Bailey, states this, of the righteous by God alone in the last judgment. I've talked about this. Of people, they look at this parable and they say, oh, it's just about the use of money. And another person will say, no, it's just about the end time judgment. No, it's just about this. No, it's just about a trickster. No, it's about an evil rich guy. You know, and people, they see in these things all these different things, and they don't realize to look at the whole and see what the bottom line is. They're only seeing a part of it. And yes, this is an end times message. It's an end time message about stewardship. It's a how much more so parable. Now, the verb form appears in the New Testament only in Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians here, or in 1 Corinthians, and here in Luke. So this verb form doesn't appear often. It says, yet the idea of a divine master offering approval in an eschatological setting is present in Matthew. Thus, the Greek word, on the level of the story itself, carries the meaning of simple approval of what the steward has done. See, because when we look at these things, and we've got the English, we don't always see the language that was behind it, the different cognizance of the words being used to know exactly what's being said. The translators, many of the translators were not correct theologians, shall I say, and they incorporated their own theology into the interpretation. So we miss quite a bit. So it does carry the simple approval of what he has done, for which thing he was commended for. At the same time, on a theological level, this word provides additional evidence for the interpreting the parable as being primarily concerned with eschatology, which is a 25-cent word for things of the end. The use of the verb that we see here is instructive. While it is true that it is presumed that an agent, remember in the last lesson we talk about agency, executes his commission, it's also true that a master can then either approve or disapprove of what an agent has done on his behalf. Remember in the last lesson I said, that the people, when they see they see this agent, they see this steward, and he's coming, all of a sudden he's just sliced their bills, and they're going, well, wow, this is great. They're thinking he must still be employed because he's doing this. They're thinking the master must have approved this, right? And so they're complicit. Remember in the last teaching I talked about complicity, that if they thought that the steward was acting on his own behalf, they would have never complied. That would have messed with the relationship that they had with the master. It's something we talked about in the last teaching. Now I want to look at the word unjust, because people, they look at this word, they look at the English connotations of this word, and believe it or not, many people decide what they're going to name the parable based on this word. But yet, and the Lord, what did he do? He approved. This is not the Lord Jesus, okay? This is the steward's employer. This is the landowner, the absentee landlord. He approved we'll soon find out what this unjust steward, because he had done wisely. In this lesson, we really have to know what some of these words mean. So the word unjust here again, it's adika, and it's injustice. So he's done an injustice. Let's look a little deeper. The injustice, it's moral. It's wrongfulness of character, iniquity, unjust, unrighteousness, or wrong. So, yeah, you could say, I suppose you could say unjust, but basically, does this describe anybody you know? It describes everybody I know, except for one, and he died on the cross for me. Outside of that, that's just pretty much everyone you know, isn't it? Aren't we all immoral on certain things? We're all unjust. So you see what I'm saying in the danger of what we ascribe to these words in their English, and why it's important to know what they really mean. Here again, there's injustice of a judge. Do we see that in any of the parables? Think Luke 18. There's a lot of parallels. Unrighteousness of heart and life. A deed violating law and justice, act of unrighteousness. Now, there's a reason I don't put a whole lot on the third part of this. You know why? Because there is another word. The New Testament translators, when they're looking at translating this, when the scriptures were written, there were two Greek words that could have been used. One is adika. The other one is anomia. What do you think anomia is? Deals with Torahlessness. Yet in many cases, does it say wickedness? Sometimes it says iniquity. But if you just look at the English, you don't know where it's dealing with Torahlessness. You don't know where it's just dealing with wickedness in general. Keep that in mind in your studies. If you have a King James concordance, like you might find in a eSword Bible program, hint, hint, play around with that. Especially look for the definition of sin and see which one of those words. And in that place, in the King James, the word for, I believe it's anomia, it's from nomos, is going to be transgressive, if I'm not mistaken. You're going to find that in the letters of John. Okay, here we go, a little bit deeper. It says an activity which is unjust, an unjust deed, unrighteousness, doing what is unjust. Where else do we see that? In Luke 13:27, get away from me, all you workers of that which is unjust. Or what does the King James say? You workers of iniquity. So every time you see a word, you can't automatically assume it's a certain Greek word. It's a certain that you've seen in one place. You really have to look it up. You really have to have your concordance. It's an important study and tools that you need to really get down, because you're going to get into some deeper insights when you do that. Okay. Going forward a little bit more, we can see adika in Genesis 6. Verse 11, verse 13. Now here are some places where you can see it. Think about in your mind. Now this is basically wickedness. This is moral character. This is that which is unjust. This is people's many who don't know God, their way of life. Look at where this is appearing. We're going to look at this. You've got some information here. I'm going to let you look at this for a little bit. And because I'm not going to look at this a whole lot, you have the ability to stop the slide and copy it down, because what I'm going to look at is Genesis 6, 9 to 13. I just didn't want to look at that one verse. I want to put it into context. And I've got the word violence, because that's the word, that's the adika. This is from the Septuagint. The Septuagint translation uses adika, our word unjust, for these scriptures. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And Noah walked with God, and Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with what? Adika. So, this is, from the Septuagint, used adika here. The same word we have in the New Testament, which deals with wrongfulness, immorality, unjust deeds, wickedness. And that's how it was used. And the reason I bring this up is because the Septuagint, when we use the Septuagint, and we can find that same Greek word in the New Testament, what does that also help us to do? Helps us get back to look at the New Testament, see the Greek word used, to see the Old Testament word they were trying to describe. If you look at this up in the Old Testament, you're not going to find adika. Why? Because the Old Testament's in Hebrew, right? Most of it. So you're going to find the Hebrew word. But do you see how to get from the Greek word in the New Testament to the Hebrew word of the Old Testament? It helps you trace it down. So the earth was filled with wickedness. The earth was filled with immorality, you can say. Not lawlessness. That's not what we're talking about at this point. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come upon me, for the earth is filled with, here it is again, adika. Here they say violence. Through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. What the Septuagint was a translation. It was a translation for the Greek speaking. And when they translated, it wasn't a word for word, it was a thought for thought translation. So we've got to understand it's not a perfect translation, but what it does is it helps us get back to the Hebrew word, so we can see what Hebrew word underlies our New Testament word. Should we look at another one? May as well. Genesis 44, 15 to 16. And Joseph said unto them, what deed is this that you have done? Wot ye not that such a man as I can certainly divine? And Judah says, what shall we say unto my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God hath found out the adika, the iniquity is the word they use here, the wickedness, the immorality, right? Of thy servants, behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also with whom the cup is found. What else we got? Genesis 49:5. It's the same word in the Septuagint. Simeon and Levi are brethren, instruments of adika. Here they say cruelty. It gives you the idea of the type of wickedness, the idea, the degree of their wickedness are in their habitations. Genesis 26:20. And the herdmen of Gerar did strive with Isaac's herdmen, saying, the water is ours, and he called the name of the well Esek, because they strove with him. I believe that's a different form of adika, but it's still there. So it gives us an idea what we're talking about as far as the unjust steward. We call him unjust, but really, is he much different than you or I? Not really. Not really. That's the point. Adika occurs in 3 Lucan passages, all parables, and all in eschatological context. Remember, 25-cent word for things of the end. You've got those here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10 and 12. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19. The term is used in contrast to messianic truth. Deeper insights. In Acts 8:23, one who seeks to buy the eschatological gift, remember that? Absolutely, is accused of being in bond of unrighteousness, adika, immorality. A bond which Yeshua declares in Luke 4:18. It is his mission to break. Sound familiar? It's an allusion to Isaiah 58:6. It's present in both passages. Moving forward. These and other considerations suggested by H. Kazmala show that adika does not refer to individual ethics, but to the universal character of this age. As we get closer and closer in the end times, does wickedness seem to be more and more open, more and more acceptable, more and more the way people think, more and more what comes out of Hollywood, what comes out of people's entertainment and music, even in the things that they vote for, the things that they say are okay, the things where they might call us intolerant, the things that we would look and we'd say, well, this is totally contrary to God. And now it's considered normal. 18:6, our misleading translation, these men are neither better nor worse than other sons of this world. And that's why I took you through those other verses. That's why I took you through adika. That's why we did a deeper look at it, so this would be easier to see. The description adika means only that they belong to this age and order their lives according to its principles. Once again, it's a how much more so parable. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. Let's look at it. Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Yeshua HaMashiach, and by our gathering together unto him, that you be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as from us, as that day of Christ is at hand. Gang, are we talking about Shabbat? No. What are we talking about? Talking about some end time stuff, aren't we? Remember I said this is an eschatological parable. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first. Definitely not talking about Shabbat. And that man of sin, being revealed, the son of perdition. Look up that word perdition sometimes. It's not adika. It is the Greek word, meaning lawlessness, Torahlessness, who opposeth and exalted himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember you not that when I was with you I told you these things, and now you know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. So notice, he's the son of perdition. You just see it in the English, right? You don't attach too much to it. But if you had seen a dika, you just think, okay, well, that's just an immoral man, right? But if you look it up and you see its Torahlessness, you definitely know who we're talking about, don't you? Absolutely. For the mystery of what? Notice something here. Look at this. I've got iniquity, wicked, and unrighteousness. I have made these words highly visible. The reason is, iniquity and wicked are both bold, unrighteousness both times are underlined. That's because these words in our English, is there that much difference in these words in English? Not a whole lot. They're somewhat interchangeable. But what I'm telling you is there's a huge difference in these words in the Greek and the corresponding Hebrew. The ones that are bold are underlined by the same word. The ones that are underlined by the same word. For the mystery of lawlessness does already work. Only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that lawlessness one be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming, even him whose coming is after the working of Hasatan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of immorality, if you want to use that. That's adika, in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them a strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in immorality. Now, don't you say that makes a big difference? Knowing what those words were? Here we go. And the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done what? Wisely. So what do we know? The Lord, the Master, not Yeshua, he appraised basically a person of this world, right? Basically a sinful person. So, because he had done wisely. So what makes it wise? Is it shrewd? Is it cunning? Is it clever? Is it underhanded? Let's find out. Strong's says prudently or wisely. Okay, we see that in a lot of our translations. Theirs. Notice the word is phronimos, prudently or wisely. We're not getting too far, are we? Let's go a little deeper. Here again, we're digging deeper from something we found on Logos. Pertaining to understanding resulting from what? Insight and wisdom. Insight and wisdom. Might that also be foresight? Absolutely. Absolutely. Everyone who hears this word of mine and obeys them is like one who has understanding. That word understanding in the Gospel of Matthew is phronimos. That's a person who has insight and wisdom, or foresight, you could say. The Master praised the unjust steward because he had acted wisely. Since the word shrewd, and that's people, when you think of shrewd, you think of somebody who just pulled off the deal of the century. Maybe somebody pulled off a cunning deal. Maybe somebody pulled off something underhanded. It's like, I really don't like the word shrewd because it's not what we're dealing with. He says, since the word shrewd, because that's what it was in the translation he used, is the key to the story, it is important to consider its meaning carefully. The Greek word means to act with foresight. If you act with foresight, you're looking at something, what does that mean? You know what's about to come, don't you? You can see the end of the road you're traveling on, and it ain't a good one. If that's the case, what are you going to do? Something to change your situation. Right? If you know the end of the road you're on just dumps off into the abyss, you're going to find another route. You're going to find a way off that road. That's what's going on with the steward. He realizes the road he's on, he's about to go over a cliff, isn't he? It's not going to be well. The Greek word means to act with foresight and is illustrated in Yeshua's discourse by the wise man. Literally, the shrewd man, that's the word he uses, who built his house on the rock in anticipation of a coming storm. Would the man who built his house on the rock in the storm, would he be wiser than the man who built it on the shifting sands? What's going to happen when the rain hits the shifting sands? It's common knowledge. It's not a surprise, is it? Away goes your house, right? You're acting with foresight. You can see the rain's about to come, so you know you've got to build your house on a solid foundation. That's acting with foresight, and that's where the word is used. It also describes the 5 wise virgins. They don't know the time that the groom is coming back, do they? But they got to be ready, don't they? But they know he's coming back, right? So if you don't know when someone's coming back, but you know they're coming back, what do? Be ready from the moment you know. Isn't that how we're supposed to live our lives? Ready from the moment we're aware? We don't know if he's coming back in the next minute. Are we prepared? That's what we're talking about here. This is what the steward's doing. It also describes the 5 wise or shrewd virgins in Matthew 25, 1-13, who bring extra oil, anticipating, right? Acting with foresight, future need. This is the dishonest manager's quality, what we're calling the dishonest manager. And in a sense, he's dishonest, because what we found out from the last parable, he charged the people an exorbitant amount for his commission. We've seen just how much it was and how long it took him to make that amount. And in one case, it's just as much as the man borrowed. Wow. He acts decisively in the present, and here it is. He acts decisively in the present to position himself for the future. His behavior is consistent with his circumstances. Sekel, this is the Hebrew word that underlines this. Common sense, practical intelligence, smarts, common sense. Of course, in our day, we look at it and we wonder what's so common about common sense anymore. It says, have more shekel, translate Greek. Boy, there's a word I don't use. Phronomotore assign, are more prudent. Yeshua is not praising this corrupt manager's goal of looking out for number one. Right? But that's essentially what he's doing. Remember, it's a how much more so. If the steward, if a man of this world knows that this world is dying, if he knows the end of the road he's on, how much more so should we, as God's children, be preparing for the day we know is coming? This is what the whole thing's been leading up to, but his cleverness, intelligence in pursuing his mistaken goal. Further, his comment that the worldly are more creative in working toward their aim than those enlightened by trusting God are in pursuing the goals God has set forth for them seems to be true today as well as then. Some might say even more so. But what are we doing? We're watering down the word. We're shortening it up. We're not challenging people. We're not encouraging people to study. We're not even encouraging them in their faith. Giving them confidence that it's okay to be a believer. Many well-intentioned people are bound when seeking solutions by lack of imagination, freedom, and in grounding in reality. Usury. Remember the last lesson. I talked about we were going to get into this and we were going to get into this deep and it was going to open up in an amazing way. Get ready. But before we do that, I want to look at the definition we gave in the previous teaching. The word used has come in modern English to mean excessive interest upon money loaned, either formally illegal or at least oppressive. In the scriptures, however, the word did not bear this sense but meant simply interest of any kind upon money. The Jews were forbidden by the law of Moses to take interest from their brethren, but were permitted to take it from foreigners. The prohibition grew out of the agricultural status of the people, because that's basically the industry of the people, right? That's what they have, in which ordinary business loans were not needed, and such loans as were required should be made only as to friends and brothers in need. In other words, they've hit hard times, you've got land, you can let them use this land. You don't want to take a man's dignity, do you? You don't want to destroy that. So what do? I say, you know what? I'm going to let you use this land, and, you can bless me with this amount of money. It's not a way of living. Granted, that's what it became. But you're saying, you know what? I'm going to let him to maintain his dignity. He can pay me in produce. Once his harvest comes, this is going to help him get on his feet. Help him, get his family going. But that's what it was supposed to be. What did it become? Big business, right? Absolutely. We talked about that in the previous teaching. We talked about that if you had land, unless you had a lot of land, it was actually cheaper. And even if you had a lot of land, it was much cheaper to just rent it out, because the property taxes to Rome were between 30 and 50%. So it was a much more viable solution. The practice of mortgaging land, sometimes at exorbitant interest, grew up among the Jews during the captivity in direct violation of the law. You've got the scriptures there for that. So, this is what I've been talking about last teaching. Let's move into it. Look at this. And the Amplified just does a wonderful job on this. He who by charging excessive interest, who does that? Who's doing that? The steward, right? 500 denarii? Remember in the last teaching we talked about just how much that was and how long it took to acquire that for either the person who was using the land for wheat and the person who's using that for oil? That was excessive. He who by charging excessive interest and who by unjust efforts to get gain increases his material possessions. Does that sound like the steward? What does it say? Gathers it for him to spend who is kind and generous to the poor. That's where we start. We're not done. Ezekiel 22, 8-14. Thou hast despised mine holy things, and hast profaned my Sabbaths. I'd say that's not starting out very good, is it? Remember, this is talking about usury. This is where we start. In thee are men that carry tales to shed blood. It's getting worse as we go. And in thee they eat upon the mountains. In the midst of thee they commit lewdness. Gang, do you want to be a part of this group? We're getting to usury somewhere in here. In thee have they discovered their father's nakedness. In thee have they humbled her that was set apart for pollution. One hath committed abomination with his neighbor's wife. This is just getting uglier, and we could say a good way. And another hath lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law. And another in thee hath humbled his sister, his father's daughter. This is the backstory. This is going to talk about usury. This is the backstory. And thee have they taken gifts to shed blood. Here it is. Thou hast taken usury and increase. How do you think God feels about it? He's not a big fan of it, is he? Look what he's lumped it in with. And thou hast greedily gained of thy neighbors by extortion, and hast forgotten me, saith the Lord God. Wow. I want you to think about something. These are scriptures, gang. They know that in the first century. All the listeners, when they're hearing the tale, they would know this. The steward who's charging these, he's expected to get something for his work. He's charging exorbitant rates. He would know this. He would know this. Behold, therefore, have I smitten mine hand at thy dishonest gain. At thy dishonest gain. Remember, I said the steward acted with foresight. He didn't have a crystal ball. What would he have known? This. He would have known the scriptures, which thou hast made, and at thy blood, which hath been in the midst of thee. Wow. Can thine heart endure? Or can thine hands be strong in the days that I shall deal with thee? And people think this isn't eschatological. This is what we're talking about with usury. I, the Lord, have spoken it, and I will do it. So you can see where the steward realizes the end of the road he's on, right? Granted, he's just looking for future employment. But you see, the hearers in the first century know these scriptures. Let's look at some more. Psalms 15, 1-5. Who shall abide in thy tabernacle? That's a place you'd want to be, wouldn't it? Talking about the Lord. Who shall dwell in that holy hill? This is something you'd want to get. He that walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. He that backbiteth not with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor. What did we just talk about, usury? God views that, he does view that as evil, doesn't he? Okay. Nor taketh up reproach against his neighbor, and whose eyes a vile person is contempt. But he honoreth them that fear the Lord. Remember, I've been talking about, and even in the last lesson, I talked about the idea that the steward, by his exorbitant rates that he was charging, what was he doing? Bringing shame upon the master. He was dishonoring the master. And if an earthly steward dishonors his master, and the end of his road is trouble, how much more so the children of God who dishonor their master? Something to think about. And whose eyes a vile person is condemned, but he honoreth them that fear the Lord. He that sweareth to his own hurt, and changeth not, he that putteth not out his money to what? Usury. Nor taketh reward against the innocent. He that does these things shall never be moved. This is common knowledge in the first century. Ezekiel 18, 3-9. As I live, saith the Lord, ye shall not have occasion any more to use this proverb in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. As the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. But if a man be just, and do that which is lawful and right, and hath not eaten upon the mountains, neither hath lifted up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, neither hath defiled his neighbor's wife, neither hath come near to a menstruous woman, and hath not oppressed any, but hath restored to the debtor his flesh, hath spoiled none by violence, hath given his bread to the hungry. What are you doing if you're giving your bread to the hungry? That is good stewardship, isn't it? Right? A lot of this is dealing with the stewardship. So this is what the steward was guilty of. Poor stewardship. Poor stewardship dishonors God. Dishonors the master. Brings shame upon them. It makes God to be looked at. Doesn't mean that God's any less, but it can force people not to believe in God. It can force people not to reach out to God because of the way we present. Because of the way the steward presented his master. It would cause other people to look down upon him. It would reflect on his standing in the community. Because what happens when the master finds out what the steward's doing and how he's seriously overcharging the people? In the court of the public opinion, he's down at the bottom of the pole, if you know what I'm saying. He hath not given forth upon what? Usury. I know I skipped a little bit. He hath not given it. He has given his bread to the hungry, and hath covered the naked with a garment. This is all stewardship. He that hath not given forth upon usury, neither hath taken any increase, that hath withdrawn his hand from iniquity, hath executed true judgment between man and man. When did the steward finally execute true judgment between man and man? He went a step further. He went a step further. Because he forewent his entire commission or interest. A certain amount would have been considered fair. But what did he do? He restored the loans, and this is what we talked about in the last teaching. He restored the loans down to their original amount. He restored the loans down to what the master originally said, hey, this is what you as a tenant farmer can use my land for. This is the price you can use. The steward added his own commission, which was an acceptable practice by man. Notice I said by man. And people would have expected that. But the steward, when he reduced it back to the real amount, he had done that. Executed true judgment between man and man. He walked, that this person has walked in my statutes and has kept my judgments to deal truly. He is just, he shall surely live, saith the Lord. Still think this is an eschatological parable? Very much so. Isaiah 24, 1-3. Now this I use the TS98. It's also known as the Scriptures. See, Adonai is making the earth empty and making it waste, and shall overturn its surface, and shall scatter abroad its inhabitants. And it shall be, as with people, so with the priest, as with the servant, so with his master. Whoa, what does that say? As with the servant, so with his master. So we might want to pay real close attention to what's going on here. As with the female servant, so with her mistress. As with the buyer, so with the seller. You see that? They're linked. As with the creditor, so with the debtor. Another common link, isn't it? The earth is completely emptied and utterly plundered, for Adonai has spoken this word. Well, what was that word? Okay, so we're going to have to find out later. But you see, this was common knowledge. This was common knowledge in the first century of what people had for usury. This is what would have come to the listener's mind. And none of the books that I had read preparing for this had that come up. So let's move forward.
Several secondary overtones exist that should not be ignored. The release from debts and the master's praise contain an implicit message that forgiving debts is a good thing.
Didn't we just see that in the scriptures on usury?
Absolutely. And that one should not be so tied to money that this is impossible. Talks about it's also an allusion to the Jubilee.
As well as, I'd go further to say it's what the Jubilee, one of the lessons the Jubilee intended
to teach us. Also, something negative is said about money is that which has only a temporary value. A day will come when it has no value, so one should use it wisely now.
Matter of fact, in a future teaching coming up shortly, it's going to talk about when it fail, or when you fail, that you make friends of the unrighteous mammon. So, and then all the scriptures say, all the different versions say, so when you fail. That's not what it actually says in the Greek. It says when it fails. In other words, when mammon fails. Can you think of some times when mammon might fail? One that should come to everybody's mind is death. Think of the tower builder. Built these beautiful towers. And just going to build more and more. He was going to prepare. What was he told? What if you have to give an accounting? Now, what if you're going to die? Then whose will these be? Right? Can you think of another time? And this should really come to mind. What if you don't have a certain mark and you can't buy or sell because, well, you really couldn't take that mark. And you knew in Scripture you couldn't take that mark. Has mammon failed you? Absolutely. Absolutely. What about another time in future, but actually it's the same time, where a bag of gold is what it takes to buy a loaf of bread? That's a mammon failed you. It failed you big time. So it's when it fails you. We'll get into that in the future teaching. Just a little something to tweak some interest there. Also, something negative said about money is that which it has only temporary value. A day will come when it has no value, so one should use it wisely now. In other words, it's something you have of which you are a steward over. The parable cannot be implemented without an eschatological awareness. I love that because that's, people, they grab one part of it and they say, this is the whole thing. The whole thing is that the day will come when you will be judged on how you honor the master or dishonor the master. Everything you have is a part of your stewardship. Everything. Your belongings, your thoughts, your actions, your deeds, your obedience, your disobedience. It's all a matter of stewardship. The wisdom that the parable seeks to elicit. If the kingdom is in some sense present, and if judgment is a reality both implicit in the parable, then actions and life stances must be determined by the kingdom and an awareness of the necessity of giving account of our stewardship of all life and especially of our possessions. Joseph Fitzmyer and J. Duncan M. Derrett provide variations on the theme that the steward does not cheat his master. We talked about that quite a bit in the last teaching, because the steward is not depriving his master of his own property when he forgives the debt. In chapter 16, 5-7, this is something we talked about the last one, so we're looking back, doing a little bit of review. Derrett argues that the amounts forgiven by the steward represent the usurious interest being charged by the steward on loans involving his master's property. Although various loopholes had been found that allowed Jews to practice default usury, we also talked about that in the last one, it was clearly de jure against God's law. Derrett argues the steward decides to align himself with God's law rather than human law. Do we see a difference between God's law and the laws we have on the books? Absolutely. It's getting more and more towards human law every day. And so we're seeing this. And for this he is commended by his master. He's commended because, remember, we talked about in the previous teaching, he finally did the right thing. He finally did the biblical thing. Fitzmyer asserts that the forgiven sum was actually the steward's commission. Regardless of whether the amount represents the steward's commission or the interest on loan, in either event, see, this is where we get caught up on details. And one of the things in the last teaching we talked about was one of the opening slides. W. Osterley said, he says, a lot of this other stuff is just details But here's the thing you need to focus on, and this was a Jewish characteristic in teachings and the way they've done things.
So regardless of whether the amounts represent the steward's commission or the interest on a loan, in either event the steward is not cheating the master by reducing the debt, since he is either forgiving his own profit or saving his master. Remember what we read about usury. Debtor, creditor, linked, right? Buyer, seller, linked. He either approves or disapproves of what the steward is doing. Chances are he's an absentee. What the first century believers is hearing is that he's an absentee landlord. Remember we talked about that. We talked about how he's probably not there. He doesn't live there. He's got the steward overlooking everything. And so he's not, totally looking over everything all the time. Because remember, we talked about in a previous teaching how he's getting reports. And he gets these reports which have been coming to him for a while. Which means he is not looking over the books on a regular basis, is he? This is what is what's going on here. So he is either foregoing his own profit or saving his master from sinning against God by engaging in what?
Usury.
Remember how we showed they're linked. The steward is called unjust in verse 8, not because of the actions in verses 5 to 7, but because of prior actions referred to by the master in 16:1. An ancient person would understand the desperation of the steward's predicament here. He's being dismissed because he dishonored his master. So when the master talks about him being wisely, even if you want to use clever, because it does have that aspect. What has the steward done? He's found a way to not only show himself as innocent, which is something a person of this world would do, right? But he's shown a way to show his master as flawless in God's law and in man's law. So yes, what he had done was Quite brilliant. This would also mean that no other wealthy man would want to hire him as a steward, since they would fear that he would bring the same kind of shame upon their household and their personal reputation. The steward must do something to prove that he's not the kind of manager who dishonors his manager, because that's going to be one of his main requirements for a job. It's why he wants to be welcomed into people's houses. He's not coming over for tea and crumpets. To have any hope of future employment as a manager, the steward needs to salvage his reputation as a good, loyal steward, and the only way he can do this is to take good care of his master, to restore his master's honor. His actions in 16:5 to 7 are designed to do just this. Hence, when the steward decides to forgive a portion of the amount owed by his master's debtors, he is desperately trying to get out of any trouble he can. Does that sound familiar? I don't want to point fingers at anybody, but we're all guilty of this in one way or another. While this seems at odds with appearances and certainly with the standard scholarly interpretation of the parables, it squares with what we know about human behavior. What does Jacob do? Jacob he offers truth, but he doesn't tell the whole truth, does he? No. He tells just enough so his side of the story still looks good. The first impulse for many people when they discover that they are in deep trouble, try to make up, right, for the misdeed and thereby get themselves out of trouble. Audiences, ancient and modern, who are left by a story to determine characters' motives or interior thoughts for themselves are likely to attribute to them motives that, 1, allow the story to make sense, and 2, are similar to their own motives in a similar circumstance, or at least understandable to them. The steward finishes his daring plan by gathering up freshly changed accounts and delivering them to the master. Remember I talked about whose writing are those in? They're in the guy who had the wheat, the guy who had the oil. The steward tells them to change this quickly. He knows he's got a short time. That's where we covered this in the last teaching. He knows he's got a short time to do it. And he's hurriedly rushing his people. He's having them doing it in their writing. And who's there to witness this in an official sense? Nobody. Who do you think was there to witness it in the initial sense for the original amounts? Nobody. Remember we talked about it's an absentee landlord. He entrusted this person to take care of all his financial arrangements and business dealings. So the steward wouldn't have had a witness. So when he presents these bills to the master, what does the master see? He sees the bills that he originally wanted. But he knows now, because people have been coming to him complaining for quite a while, that that wasn't the case. Once again, you can see why he talks about this man being clever, being wise. He's managed to make both of them appear innocent, which the master is innocent, but the steward has been, you could say, in a sense, forgiven by the master. We don't know whether he still has a job or not, but the parable doesn't teach us that. The master knows full well that in a local village there has already started a great round of celebration and praise of him. Back in the last teaching, we talked about just how much those amounts really were. For people to borrow that amount, keep this in mind, these were people, these were not hobby farmers, okay? Those were large amounts that took large amount of acres to produce. We talked about this in the previous teaching. So they were people of substance. Would those people have needed a steward? Quite possibly. Might they have had a number of people that they had underneath them that needed to be overlooked? A lot of things that they got going on? Absolutely. Would the steward want to be welcome in those situations if he's no longer welcome here? You know, the last one we talked about the shame of digging. And we got into Ben Sirach chapter 40, and we laid all that out. So it all starts to play in. It all starts to come together here. The people are seeing, they're going, wow, my bill, 500 denarii, that part of it's been wiped out. That's awesome. How's the master looking now? He's looking like a pretty good guy. He's restored the master's honor. They got a celebration going. Kenneth Bailey lived in the Middle East for 30 years. So he writes how he's seen the Middle East act, and it was an Arab culture, but that culture hasn't changed through time. Like many other cultures, they've adapted through time. That culture has stayed the same. It's as close as we can get to a first century Israel without an actual time machine of some sort. Master is seen as the most noble and most generous man that ever rented land in their district. He has two alternatives. He can go back to the debtors and explain, hey, guys, there's been a misunderstanding here. No. Hey, I appreciate the party, but you still owe me the amount, right? That's one option. It's all a mistake. That the steward had been dismissed, and thus his action was null and void, but if the master does this now, the villager's joy will turn to anger, and he will be cursed for his stinginess. That doesn't look like a good choice, does it? Second, he can keep silent, accept the praise that is even now being showered on him, and allow the clever steward to ride high on the wave of popular enthusiasm. So you can see where the steward actually was quite brilliant in this. The master is a generous man. To be generous is a primary quality of a nobleman in the East. Isn't it Matthew 8 that says, the pure in heart shall see God? There's another verse that says, to the merciful, God shows himself merciful. There's a lesson here. He reflects for a moment and then turns to the steward and says, you're a very wise fellow. One of the Old Testament definitions of wisdom is an instinct for self-preservation. In a backhanded way, the actions of the steward are a compliment to the master. The steward knew the master was generous and merciful. That's what he was gambling on. If that part of his gamble fails, if part of your gamble is to say, you're going to go to these people and you're going to forgive 500 denarii, is that much of a gamble? That is no gamble whatsoever, because if they believe you're still in authority doing it, do they want their bill reduced by 500 denarii? Absolutely. That's not a gamble. The gamble is, you better be right. Your master better be merciful. And he is. And he is. The steward knew that the master was generous and merciful. He risked everything on this aspect of the master's nature. He won because the master was indeed generous and merciful. He chose to pay the full price for his steward's salvation. If this, and this is what I keep saying, the last two teachings, this has been a common thing I've said often. If this dishonest steward solved his problem by relying on the mercy of his master and solved his crisis, how much more so
Will God help you in your crisis when you trust in His mercy? It's a story about a rich man and his estate manager. The master's justice in such stories reaches a higher standard than that of the common person. His generosity is prized in a community that receives his benevolence. The theme of stewardship focuses on the proper use of another's trust. The steward should make good use of the master's resources. We've seen numerous commentaries where they say, well, it's just like the prodigal son, and you can compare the two and get a lot of insights because they are a doublet, so to speak. But the prodigal son, it says, yes, they both have squandered or wasted, but the prodigal son afterwards says how he wasted it. In this parable, that's not mentioned. To assume that he just blew the money on himself or in riotous living, that's an assumption. We're not told. So we don't know. But what we do know, he had unscrupulous dealings with people. In that, he was wasting the master's goods. The theme of stewardship focuses on the proper use of another's trust. The steward should make good use of the master's resources. Remember I talked about this from the Amidah. I believe this was in part 1 of this series. Remember we talked about the steward in this teaching. He was banking on the master's mercifulness. That's the only thing we've got to truly bank on, gang. Because we make mistakes. We can ask forgiveness for the same stinking thing again and again and again, right? And this benediction, this is one of the 3 benedictions in the Amidah, where they are known as the benedictions of thanksgiving. This is the Hoda'ah. And it's roughly translated, grateful acknowledgement. It goes like this. We thank you and praise you, O Lord our God, and the God of our fathers, for all your kindness, love, and the mercy that you have graciously bestowed upon us and our fathers before us. And as we proclaim, oh, that we might sing praises to you and not be silent, that we should give thanks to you forever. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger and of great mercy. The Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works. All thy works shall praise thee, O Lord, and thy saints shall bless thee. For when we say our foot slips, your mercy, O Lord, holds us up. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no change nor shadow of turning. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, in all things and at all times. It is good to give you thanks. In part 1, I had mentioned how this would make a wonderful blessing for the males. Make a wonderful blessing upon waking, upon going to bed. The idea that thankfulness is to be an everyday part of your life. The idea that he is a merciful God. That he even knows before your foot slips. He knows it's about to slip. And he's ready to hold you up. He's ready. He's willing. He's able. And like the father and the prodigal son, the one who's coming back to his father, is pretty beaten down. Pretty broken up. Pretty without hope. He has merely, remember in the last lesson we talked about Teshuvah, and it was the idea that you were walking the wrong stinking way, and now you're walking back towards God. And what does God do when he sees you walking towards him? He takes off running like the father of the prodigal son. That's mercy, gang. That is mercy. Now this benediction is not what you will find in most of your modern Sidduras. This is taken from our Siddur. We went to try and get back as close as we could to first century Israel, and this is what we had come up with.